What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Saturday, August 7th.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate tonight, so let's take a look at the pitcher position. I like Julio Urias with a 9% pitching advantage over a low-salary batting team, the Los Angeles Angels. Julio Urias is only giving up a .627 OPS versus righties, and he's facing 9 righties here tonight. Now, the Angels have hit 7 of his last 12 pitches, but it's such a small sample size that we got to throw that number out. And Julio Urias is $10,000 FanDuel salary. He's 500 more on DraftKings. So he's projected at 23.1 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 30 fantasy points or more in this one. He has an ERA of 3.40. His record is 13-3. He's pitching an average of 88 pitches per game, averaging 35 fantasy points per game. He scored 42, 29, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Julio Urias here versus the Los Angeles Angels. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. I'm going to give you a stud pick here. Now guys, there's actually a ton of awesome matchups on this slate for batters. So I've got some value plays mixed in with these stud picks so you can fit a mix of these guys into your lineup. But the first stud that I got for you is Joey Votto with a 53% batting advantage over Mitch Keller. Joey Votto is batting 32% better versus righty pitchers. He's batting a .952 OPS versus righties. And Mitch Keller, he's throwing 21% worse to lefties as he does righties, giving up a .837 OPS versus lefties. Joey Votto is 1 for 2 with a 2.5 OPS versus Keller because that one hit was for a home run. He's 4,100 FanDuel salary. He's 2,000 more on DraftKings. Projected at 13.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been on fire, scoring 6, 26, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And I like this pick because Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Joey Votto here versus Mitch Keller. I also like Freddy Freeman with a 42% batting advantage over Josiah Gray. Freddie Freeman is batting 33% better versus righty pitchers, batting a 1.096 OPS versus righties. And Josiah Gray, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 9% worse than his pitch to righties, giving up a .905 OPS versus lefties. Freddie Freeman is 3,700 FanDuel salary. He's 1,800 more on DraftKings. Projected at 12.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25, 13, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Freddie Freeman here versus Josiah Gray. I also like Salvador Perez with a 37% batting advantage over Kwang Hyun Kim. Salvador Perez bats 12% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .990 OPS versus lefties. And Kwang Hyun Kim, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 24% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .697 OPS versus righties. Now, there's no at-bats versus Kim yet, and Salvador Perez is 3,300 FanDuel salary. He's 1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 6, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Salvador Perez here versus Kwang Hyun Kim. And I also like Yandy Diaz with a 54% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Spencer Watkins. Yandy Diaz, he bats a little bit better versus righty pitchers, batting a .780 OPS versus righties, and Spencer Watkins, he pitches 50% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .684 OPS versus righties. Yandy Diaz is 0 for 2 versus Watkins, but he's only 3,100 FanDuel salary. He's 1,900 more on DraftKings, projected at 12.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 0, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 10 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Yandy Diaz here versus Spencer Watkins. Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. Here's a value play for you. I like Adam Frazier with a 38% batting advantage over Taylor Widener. Adam Frazier bats 8% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .743 OPS versus righties. And Taylor Widener, he throws his worst ball by far to lefty batters, 31% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .986 OPS versus lefties. So Adam Frazier is 2 for 3 with a 1.334 OPS versus Widener. He's only 2,700 FanDuel salary, and he's only 800 more on DraftKings. Projected at 9.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12, 10, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Adam Frazier here versus Taylor Widener. Now, this is a FanDuel pick. This is a value play. I like Mike Moustakas with a 52% batting advantage over Mitch Keller. Mike Moustakas, he's batting 31% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .847 OPS versus righties. And Mitch Keller pitches 21% worse to lefties as he does righties, giving up a .837 OPS versus lefties. Now, Mike Moustakas is 1 for 4 versus Keller, but I like this pick because he's only 2,500 FanDuel salary. He's projected at 10.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 31, 0, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Mike Moustakas on FanDuel here versus Mitch Keller.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, another value play. I like Luis Arias with an 87% batting advantage over Luis Garcia. Luis Arias is batting 25% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .814 OPS versus righties, and Luis Garcia, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 62% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.013 OPS versus lefties. Luis Arraez is $2,500 FanDuel salary. He's $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 8.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 7, 3, and 21 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Luis Arraez here versus Luis Garcia. Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I like Jose Ramirez with a 42% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Tyler Alexander. Jose Ramirez is batting 23% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.118 OPS versus lefties. And Tyler Alexander, he pitches almost his worst ball. He pitches a .916 OPS versus switch hitters. And I like this pick because Jose Ramirez is 3 for 6, batting .500 with a 1.5 OPS versus Alexander. He's $3,700 FanDuel salary, $2,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 16.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 13 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 19, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Jose Ramirez here versus Tyler Alexander. Okay, let's take a look at the shortstop position. Here's a stud pick for you. I like Trevor Story with a 43% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Jesus Luzardo. Trevor Story bats 21% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .970 OPS versus lefties. And Jesus Luzardo, he's pitching 22% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .863 OPS versus righties. So he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, and Trevor Story is 1 for 1 with a 2 OPS versus Luzardo. Trevor Story is $4,300 FanDuel salary, $1,300 more on DraftKings, projected at 12 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 22, 41, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So he's been on fire, and Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 11 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Trevor Story here versus Jesus Luzardo. I also like Corey Seeger with a 41% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Jamie Barria. Corey Seager bats 9% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .877 OPS versus righties. And Jamie Barria, he's pitching his worst ball versus lefty batters, 32% worse than his pitch to righties, giving up a .795 OPS versus lefties. Now, Corey Seager is 0 for 2 versus Barria, but the splits are good, and he's $3,000 FanDuel salary, $2,200 more on DraftKings. Although I think this DraftKings slate doesn't have some of these games, so those might be showdown prices. You have to check that out. But he is projected at 11.9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 4, 12, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Corey Seager here versus Jamie Barria. I also like Carlos Correa. He's batting against a low salary pitcher, Michael Pineda. Carlos Correa is batting a .762 OPS versus righties, and Michael Pineda, he's giving up a .568 OPS versus righties, so he actually pitches his best ball versus righty batters. But the reason that I like this pick is because Carlos Correa is 11 for 21, batting a .524 batting average and a 1.685 OPS versus Pineda. He has 3 home runs, 4 doubles, so he crushes Pineda. He's 3,400 FanDuel salary, and he's only 500 more on DraftKings. Projected at 9.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 22, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Carlos Correa here versus Michael Pineda. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. Here's another stud pick for you. I like Jesse Winker with a 50% batting advantage over Mitch Keller. Jesse Winker is batting 29% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .999 OPS versus righties, and Mitch Keller throws 21% worse to lefties as he does righties, giving up a .837 OPS versus lefties. I like this pick because Jesse Winker is 3 for 5, batting .600 with a 1.2 OPS versus Keller. He's 4,100 FanDuel salary, 2,200 more on DraftKings, projected at 14.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 34, 3, and 6 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Jesse Winker here versus Mitch Keller. I also like Franmil Reyes with a 29% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Tyler Alexander. Franmil Reyes is batting a .753 OPS versus lefties, and Tyler Alexander, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 44% worse than his pitch to lefties, giving up a .949 OPS versus righties. Franmil Reyes is 2 for 2 with a 3.5 OPS versus Alexander. One of those 2 hits is for a home run. He's 3,500 FanDuel salary, 1,500 more on DraftKings, projected at 13.7 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 12, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Franmil Reyes here versus Tyler Alexander. I also like Michael Brantley. He's been one of my favorite picks all week long. He's consistently underpriced on DraftKings. He's been performing, and he's in another good spot here tonight. He's got a 40% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Michael Pineda. Michael Brantley is batting 31% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .943 OPS versus righties, and Michael Pineda is giving up a .628 OPS versus lefties. Now, he is only 2 for 8 versus Pineda, and he's 3,300 FanDuel salary, but he's 300 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. Projected at 10.9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 6, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Michael Brantley here versus Michael Pineda.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.